All right, now let's take a look at the upload action in Photos controller. Here we're dealing with a very large action. Look, there's so much code here. Ideally, we want to keep our methods short, between 5 to 10 lines of code. And of course, that's not a strict requirement, but that's something that we should aim for. Here we have a lot of code, so that's telling me something is not quite right here. So how are we going to refactor this? Well, imagine in the future, we're going to use a different framework to build this application. So today we're using ASP.NET Core. Tomorrow, chances are there's going to be a new shiny framework. With this implementation, we basically have to write all this code using the new framework. Now you may argue that, Mosh, how do you know that's going to happen? What are the chances? Maybe in 5 years' time, yes, we're going to have a different framework, but there's going to be a different approach to building software. That's absolutely right. However, what I want to point out here is the separation of concerns. So here, our action is doing too many things, and that's why we have quite a few lines of code in this method. By having proper separation of concerns, each method will be between 5 to 10 lines of code. It will be easier to read, to maintain, and easier to test. So let's start our refactoring. I'm going to keep some code here that is specific to ASP.NET Core, like this part where we're returning bad requests, or where we're returning the not found message. These are specific to ASP.NET Core. Then I'm going to extract the other part that is specific to our application logic, like storing a file in a directory, or further below, adding a photo to the database. These parts are specific to our application. They're not tied to ASP.NET Core. They're application logic, or they're the business logic of our application. So in the core folder, I'm going to add a new interface and call it iPhoto service. So here, service represents an application service layer. You can think of application service layer as an API for your application. It's like a layer that wraps your application functionality, and it exposes simple functions that you can call using a presentation framework. It can be WPF, it can be ASP.NET Core, it can be ASP.NET MVC, or a new framework in the future. So iPhoto service. Now in our application, we want to have the ability to upload a photo for a vehicle. So here I'm going to add a method void upload photo. Now what parameters do we need here? Let's go back to our controller. So in our upload action, we get vehicle ID and iForm file. So initially I'm going to use these, but chances are we're going to change this later. So let's copy these two parameters back to iPhoto service and add them here. Now look at iForm file. Let's import the namespace. So note that this is defined in Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.http. So this interface is specific to ASP.NET Core. And that means here I'm adding a dependency to ASP.NET Core. So if in the future I want to use a different framework like WPF, this implementation would not work because here we're coupled to ASP.NET Core. So ideally we should have our own interface, like something called iFile that is part of our application domain. Now for now, don't worry about this because here we're working specifically with ASP.NET Core, and I just want to show you how to refactor a large action. So let's revert this back. Potentially in the future, we can come back and fix this issue. Now here's our service. Let's create an implementation for this. So public class photo service implements iPhoto service. Now with command and period, implement interface explicitly. And then I'm going to move this to a separate file. Now back in the controller, I'm going to leave this part here because this part is specific to ASP.NET Core. Here we're doing basic validation and returning bad requests or not found messages. So these are specific to building APIs with ASP.NET Core. If you want to use WPF to build a desktop interface for this application, we cannot return a bad request or a not found message. It doesn't make sense. So I'm going to grab this part, which is our application logic. So all the way up to here, up to completing the unit of work. Cut back to photo service and paste it here. All right, now let's import the namespaces. First, path from system.io. Okay, now here we need host, which is iHosting environment. Again, this interface belongs to ASP.NET Core, so I want to reduce this dependency. Note that here, all we need from this host is the web root path, and we use that to construct the path to the uploads folder. So instead of adding a dependency to iHosting environment, I would prefer to take this code back inside Photos controller. So cut, put it back here. So here we get the uploads folder path, and we can pass this as an argument to our photo service. So back to the photo service interface, I'm going to add a third parameter here, string uploads folder path. And obviously we need to add this parameter in our implementation as well. So let's go to the photo service, add it here. Now the errors are gone. So first we create the directory if it doesn't exist. We generate a new file name. We construct a file path. Now we need to store this file. So here we have a compilation error, and that's because our method is not async. So let's make this public, async, task, and we should also change this in the interface. So back to iPhoto service, change void to task, and import the namespace. Okay, that's better. Now back to the implementation. Let's import the namespace here as well. All right, it's getting better. So we store the file. Next, we need to add the photo to the database. So first, let's import the namespace for the photo class. Now here we need a vehicle object. What we can do is go here. Instead of getting a vehicle ID, we can get the vehicle object. In fact, it's better if your service layer works with your domain objects. So the inputs and the output are domain objects. So let's change this to vehicle. And of course, we need to change this in the interface as well. That's the pain with changing these manually in VS Code. In Visual Studio, using ReSharper, you can immediately apply these refactorings. So, okay, let's import the namespace. Good. Now back to the photo service. So the compilation error with the vehicle object is gone. Now finally we need a unit of work. So let's add the constructor here. Photo service takes iUnit of work, and we call this unit of work. Now let's initialize field from parameter. Beautiful. So with this, we complete the unit of work. Okay, perfect. Now back in the Photos controller. Here we need to use our new service. So first, let's add that as a dependency to this constructor. So iPhoto service, call it photo service, and initialize field from parameter. Okay. Now back to our action. So we construct the uploads folder path. Then we call photo service that upload photo. As the first argument, we pass the vehicle object that we got here from the repository. Okay. As the second argument, we pass this iForm file object. And as the third argument, we pass uploads folder path. Now, this is an async method, so we need to await it. Now, finally, we need to map this photo object to a photo resource. Now, you might ask why I didn't move this part, mapping a photo to photo resource, inside the service. Because this is something that we want to return from this action. What if in the future we have another client or another consumer for our photo service? Maybe they want to work with a different object instead of photo resource. So by returning a photo object from our service, our design will be more flexible because the consumer of this service, in this case, this action, can decide what to do with that photo object. Here we want to map it to a photo resource. Somewhere else, maybe we want to map it to something else. Who knows? So we need to change the signature of our method to return a photo object. So something like this. We get a photo object and then map it to photo resource. Now let's go to our new interface. So here we want to return a task of photo. And now let's change the implementation as well. Okay, so task of photo. And of course, we need to return it at the end of this method. So return photo. Now back in the controller, all the errors are gone. Note that our action is immediately shorter. It's almost half the size. All we are doing is doing some basic validation on the top. Then we're delegating to the photo service. So the details of what happens when we upload a photo is encapsulated inside the service. And finally, we map the photo that we get to a photo resource and return it to the client, in this case, Angular. Now we're not done with this refactoring. There's still more work to do, but I want to finish this lecture. So we need to register our new service for dependency injection. Let's go to the startup class and configure services method. I'm going to call services.add transient. Now this time I'm going to use add transient because with our photo service, we don't have anything in the memory that we want to reuse in the context of a request. So it's not like our repository where we're dealing with a DB context and we're loading some objects from the database. It's very simple. It's transient. So iPhoto service is implemented by the photo service class. All right, that's the first step. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. Back to the photos controller. Let's look at the constructor. So here we have a dependency to iUnitOfWork, but we're using this inside our photo service. So we no longer need this dependency. Let's remove it. And here as well, iUnitOfWork. Now our controller is a little bit more lightweight. Okay, that's better. In the next lecture, we're going to continue with this refactoring.